So welcome, everyone. I see lots of people have been trickling in and lots of familiar names coming in. So welcome to our panel discussion today that we've titled Knowing What Is Okay, Recruiting Participants for Clinical Research at UCI. And I think we have a really terrific panel today that is being brought to you by co-coordinators here from the Institute for Clinical and Translational Science, Program in Public Health, and the Institute for Future Health. And my name is Michael Hoyt. I'm an associate professor in the Program for Public Health. And, you know, when I approached Margaret to get her interested in putting together this panel and helping me, which she ended up doing the lion's share of the organization for, I was just so selfishly excited to be talking about this topic today. As a researcher here at UCI, I know that this is a topic that is the one that keeps me up at night as a researcher in thinking about how are we going to recruit our patients, particularly for clinical research, and how do we do it the right way and sort of understanding the system and the ins and outs. And so I'm really hoping that so much of the confusion and misconceptions that I carry, and I know, having heard from so many of you, that many of you carry as well, will get to be talked about today. But before we go further, I'm going to turn it over to one of the co-organizers here today, Amir Rahmani, who's going to introduce himself on the panel.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, this is Amir Rahmani. I'm an associate professor with the School of Nursing and also Departments of Computer Science and ECS. Also represent the Institute for Future Health, IFH, as its associate director. Let me also introduce our terrific panelists. We are so honored today for the opportunity of having three great panelists, Kai Zhang, Christian Hui, and Mary Alexander. Kai Zhang, he's a professor at Departments of Informatics and Emergency Medicine. He's also the director of Center for Biomedical Informatics at ICTS, the Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. We also have Christine Hui, Chief Administrative Officer at Chow Family Comprehensive Cancer Center, and also Mary Alexander, the Research Compliance Officer at UCI Health Compliance and Privacy Office. So quite a diverse sort of panels. And I would like to also introduce our other co-organizer, Dr. Margaret Schneider. She was really kind of very helpful and kind of took the lead of organizing this event. And so Dr. Schneider, she is the evaluation director at the UCI Institute for Clinical and Translational Research. So she's going to help us with also the moderation to moderate the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, please directly type that into the Q&A box. There is this button that you can use. And we're going to, I guess, try to collect all of them. And at the end, we will ask and share those with our great panelists. So now let me again, I'll hand it over to Michael to introduce the format of this panel and the way we have structured for you. Please.
Great, thanks, Amir. So we have put together today's panel in sort of a few segments, and each segment is going to be introduced by a very brief vignette to get us talking, to get us thinking about sort of real-world applications to some of the questions that we've put together. And then hopefully either at the end or in our follow-up to all of you, we'll get to many of your questions that you still have. So I will direct some of the questions to some of the panelists that may want to sort of tackle some of these questions, but I certainly, as we go through, hope this is a true panel discussion, and don't want to limit anyone from jumping in when you have something to add to any of these questions that we'll put forth today. I just want to mention to all of you, if you didn't realize, that we are recording today's session, And we will have that posted and available on the ICTS website and possibly the website for the Institute for Future Health following the panel. Okay. So why don't we jump into our first vignette and our first segment, which we've really tried to get at some of the primary topics related to sort of clinical recruitment and operational issues. And so I'm going to read this brief vignette. So John is a main campus researcher who studies health-related quality of life after cancer and cancer treatment. He's launching a study that involves recruiting patients with urologic cancers who have recently completed surgery or chemotherapy treatment for their diagnosis. He's obtained his IRB approval, and now he's trying to get started in identifying a group of patients he can screen and potentially invite into the study. Like most researchers, he turns his attention to the clinics where these patients get care. So although John has access to the Epic system, he isn't really sure about what's okay for him to do. Sounds near and dear to my heart as a vignette. So maybe we should start our conversation here about that idea of Epic. What is the process for getting access to Epic? How long does it take? Who do I contact? If we could sort of start there.
Yes, this scenario, Dr. White, sounds extremely familiar to the research that you performed when you first arrived here at UC Irvine and when I was able to meet with you. That's a really great question. I want to tackle that and also allow my panelist colleagues to respond as well. So Epic is our EMR system here at UC Irvine and UC Irvine Health. To obtain Epic access, you need to submit a ticket into the IT system. And once after you submit that ticket through just our normal IT ticketing system, you'll be contacted by an individual who will train research coordinators about how to utilize Epic. It's dependent on coordinators' level of access that they need in terms of if you're just reviewing the EMR versus if you need to actually progress note inside of that EMR. But once you enter that ticket, you'll be contacted by the appropriate individual and go through a training and need to complete all the necessary training and paperwork related to getting access into the EMR.
Great. And Christine, just for clarification, is that something anyone who's a faculty here doing research at UCI can do?
So in order to ensure appropriate compliance measures with getting into the EMR, we want to make sure, obviously, when submitting the IRB application and protocol to our institutional review board, if you're looking at screening the electronic medical record, it's important to notify the IRB this way through the IRB application. Oftentimes, you can ask for what's often referred to as a HIPAA waiver in order to screen for potential research participants in a research trial. So this is all part of the regulatory pathway to making sure that you're obtaining the correct approvals. Once you have those correct approvals from our institutional review board, and then yes, going through the appropriate channels of submitting the ticket and then gaining access to the EMR. As coordinators gain access to the EMR and start to review it, it's really important to make sure that they work really diligently and collaboratively with the clinician or the provider to whom they're reviewing, their schedule. It's important to establish those relationships ahead of time, make sure that clinical research coordinators and researchers know that they should be working together and teaming together with those providers and clinicians, letting them know about their research study and what type of research participants that they need to enroll into their research study, and just collaborating with them as they work to try and enroll their patients into the trial.
That's really great. And I think an opportunity a lot of people who are looking for patients for their research trials would be very interested in. So you mentioned sort of screening through Epic clinician schedules. Would that be the primary way you would sort of identify possible patients? Can you say a little bit more about how that typically goes?
Yeah, depending on the type of patients that you need to enroll into the study or the trial, you're going to want to gain a certain level of access into Epic and learn how to use it. And that's where you would gain that training through entering the ticket and getting trained on it. And then from there, again, depending on the eligibility criteria of your particular research study, you're going to want to look into the EMR to determine if there's individuals who are eligible, for that particular study. So that information housed in Epic can be located in many different areas, and the EMR can be at times a difficult area to navigate. So getting that training is really important. And then from there, perusing schedules is really important. And then depending on the complexity of the study or the trial, you'll need to look at other areas to determine eligibility for the research study that you have.
That's great. That's great. So going back to our vignette, right? We can imagine that John has access to Epic, that has gone through some of the processes that you mentioned in terms of IRB, and so he might even have identified patients in there that he thinks may be appropriate to contact for his study. So what should John be thinking about when he's finally sort of identified someone or a group of patients that he'd like to contact to possibly get screened further for his study?
Yeah, so what John should really be thinking about is he should be connecting with the provider and the physicians, all the support clinical staff that are in that particular clinic, making them aware of the type of study that he has and the type of patients he's looking for. So that way, they can also assist if they see patients that are potentially eligible for that study. And really, again, the key is to developing those relationships and making sure that that particular provider understands that John will be recruiting from, the provider's clinic, obtaining their consent and authorization to do so, even talking a little bit about the study and sharing consent forms and protocols so that those individuals and the providers feel really comfortable about the type of study it is and how their patients are being approached. And then once they identify those individuals, it's really about approaching them in an appropriate fashion, making sure that once they've approached those individuals, they notify the provider and the physician, letting them know, I plan on approaching, patient XYZ. This is someone who is potentially eligible for my research study, and I'd like to approach them. And as you begin to develop that relationship and kind of the cadence, if you will, with that particular provider and investigator, then it can become a bit more natural in terms of as you continue to work together, making sure that they're okay, of course, with you approaching their patients, and the patients, of course, whomever are interested, continue to be interested, and then, of course, can get consented into the research study. And then, of course, it's important to think about where you're going to consent these individuals, depending on the type of study that you have. If it's sensitive in nature, you want to make sure that you have an appropriate location to be able to talk to them about the study, and that if a private location is ideal and best when trying to enroll patients into studies.
So that's so great. And I think just the type of information John would need to get started on doing this. And this relationship building that you identify with the providers sounds like it's really key to sort of to a smooth process. But I think there's still some questions that people have about their responsibility to those providers. We know providers are very busy and they hear about our studies and happily say they'd like to help if they can, but then they forget about some of our studies. And so it could be a surprise to them down the road if all of a sudden you show up and they had forgotten about you. What kind of permission is actually needed that needs to be explicit? The courtesy communication that you identify is really clear, but what about the regulatory part?
Well, I think it's always really, really wise to, as much as you can, to develop that partnership, because they can also help to identify patients for you. But of course, our providers are very busy clinicians. And so they may not always be, may not always be at top of mind. The research study that you're trying to carry out and implement in the clinic. This is where I also think it's important to involve the support staff of that particular provider. So whether it be their nurses or other support staff that they have, in order to really ensure that, you have their permission and are able to, approach their patients for for participation potentially in the research study. There's no better way than to, really try to establish that relationship as much as possible. And so it does mean that you have to be persistent at times. And it's also wise to really find a partner, if you can, who's really engaged in research, someone who has a passion for research. We work at an academic medical center. And so being at an academic medical center, many, clinicians, physicians are very interested in performing research. And so it's really trying to partner with those individuals, asking around, trying to figure out which providers have a deeper interest in research. Probably that from the get-go will help you, establish that rapport and that collegial relationship that you need to develop in order to make sure that you can continue to reach out to their patients. So that component, I think, is really important, identifying those individuals. And sometimes it takes, asking around, trying to figure out, maybe even looking at their faculty profile and seeing, who's interested in research, who will understand, what I'm trying to accomplish, and then be sympathetic towards that.
Yeah. And I've heard different clinicians say, I'd love to support you. Yes, go to my patients. They don't necessarily have the time to respond to each request. Like, hey, I see patient X is coming in Thursday. I'm going to contact them. Is that okay to just sort of keep them in the loop? But if the loop isn't always closed, is it sort of an expressed agreement between the researcher and the clinician?
And that's where I think, like, as you start to develop, hopefully, that relationship and then that cadence, you can eventually get the trust of working together with that clinician, just knowing that, depending again on the type of research study it is, if it's a simple survey, it might be just, now that I've done this a couple of times and it seems to be going well, you can then, obviously move and evolve that collegial relationship, ask them if it's okay to go ahead and just approach anyone who's eligible. Do they feel like it's necessary that they need to get express permission every single time? It's probably going to be very dependent on the type of study that you have. Something as easy as a survey, the providers might be fine with it. As the studies get more complex or require more of their patients' time, they're probably definitely going to want to know about that. And we have to remember they have a clinic to run, and they have patients to see and are scheduled. And so they need to, you always want to be mindful of that clinic workflow and what that looks like.
Yeah. So useful. So helpful. John has told me that he's heard from lots of his colleagues that patients sign. There's this sort of story going around that patients sign something when they come on as a UCI health patient that allows researchers to contact them, some agreement. Can you clarify this? Is this a myth? Is this real? Do we know much about this?
Yeah, I can talk about this a little bit, and then I'd like to involve Mary Alexander from compliance also to chime in as well. Um, so specifically, I come from the Cancer Center, so I'm going to speak a little bit more closely related to that particular area. But yes, you're absolutely right. When you sign consent forms here to be treated, there is a provision that indicates that we are a research institution and that we perform research here. So specifically from a cancer center perspective, what we do, we have what's called an experimental tissue resource core. And so a lot of leftover tissue that's not needed for diagnostic purposes or clinical purposes, tissue that, obviously needs to be saved for diagnostic purposes. Any of that kind of leftover tissue can be used for research purposes. We go through the process of making sure that those tissues are retained, and then if they need to be used, depending on what type of information we need on that tissue from a research investigator standpoint, what clinical information we need, it can either be requested through a non-human subjects form, or, if you need more information on that particular tissue, then going through the appropriate full regulatory IRB channels. So that's what it looks like, again, coming a little bit from the Cancer Center perspective. And then Mary, I don't know if you had more to add.
Sure, happy to. So the consent, Christine did a great job summarizing and bringing in, these repositories. There are two documents when a patient is registered at UCI, and one is what Christine referred to. It's called the Terms and Conditions of Service. And there's a second document, and it's called the Notice of Privacy Practices. Both documents, one is required by HIPAA, and then one is the Terms and Conditions of Service. Both documents do let patients know that we are a research organization, as Christine was explaining, and that because of that, we may use their health-related information in order to, one, contact them to recruit them for research projects, or two, we might use their health-related information for research in which we would not contact them, but it doesn't require their involvement. It's really just use of their information. These documents do outline that there is a special review process, and that would be the IRB approval, which the IRB would, of course, always ensure that any projects doing this with patient health information would address both common rule requirements for informed consent or a waiver of informed consent and HIPAA privacy requirements for either HIPAA authorization or a waiver of HIPAA authorization. And so right now, these are the two documents that are presented to patients when they become patients. And I think these are the documents that you may be referring to.
That's so clear and so useful. And I can hear from the crowd telepathically them saying, wait a minute, if patients have agreed to be contacted for research, why do I need the clinician in the loop? What do you think about that?
I would say there are a couple of layers here. One is that any unique IRB project requires its own waiver and its own HIPAA, its own waiver of consent, its own HIPAA authorization or waiver of HIPAA authorization. In addition to this layer of review for use of data, the IRB also has to approve the recruitment method. And they evaluate that on an individual basis, determining, it will consider the type of study, the setting in which the patient is recruited. It'll determine whether a relationship exists with the researcher who is doing the recruiting. And they evaluate various factors in order to make a determination on what's appropriate and what is protecting the right, safety, and welfare of these patients. And so while this is very much, a notification more so to the patients that, hey, here's who we are, here's what might happen. HIPAA requires this, notice of privacy practices to patients saying we're a covered entity, here's how we'll use your data. And then same with, terms of conditions of service, that we are an academic medical center and here's what we do with your health information. And so, it really is, I think there are two pieces of the regulations that are being addressed in each one, in this notice and the terms and conditions, along with the IRB review process, and then them issuing a specific waiver for that particular project and evaluating the recruitment method for that project, depending on a number of factors.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
And I can attest to that. Sorry to interrupt. In that, at the Cancer Center, we have a very large portfolio of research studies and trials, and almost virtually all of them, we request a HIPAA waiver so that we can review medical records ahead of time to determine if a patient is eligible for a particular study that we have. We have quite a number of studies and trials in our department, and so we like to review the records ahead of time and evaluate them, and then talk with the clinician, physician, and provider to make sure that it makes sense to see if we can approach those patients and work obviously in tandem with the provider. That's
great. This is so useful in learning, how to navigate the system and keep patients protected. So I'm going to move on to the second segment here, and it's a continuation of our vignette. And so, now that John's explored this clinic-based recruitment method, he also realized that expanding his recruitment of patients could be quite useful. And so someone suggested to him that he should use something called the honest broker system to identify patients, which John had never heard of before. So I'm wondering if the panel can tell us a little bit about the honest broker system and how it can be used for recruitment.
Yeah, so the honest broker system basically means that we have a team of data analysts who will be helping researchers go into the back-end clinical data warehouse to build a precise query based on the exclusion criteria, based on the data elements desired, and then retrieve the information about the patient. So that way, you don't have to go through EPIC patient by patient in order to identify all possible candidates, which is impossible if your sample is large, and also if the criteria you use are complex. So honest broker will be able to retrieve that information for you, give you all medical record number, first name, last name, email, depending on your IRB, of course. And then you have a list of the information, a list of the patients who meet your inclusion and exclusion criteria. You also have additional information about them. For instance, their past medical history, the medications they are on. So you're able to do further studies to narrow down the specific patient population you are most interested in. And again, that way you can retrieve information from the backend, the clinical data warehouse, without using the EPIC, the EHR, in order to identify your patient population.
That's really great. Sounds like a really useful tool. How might a researcher sort of get started or learn more if they are thinking, that could be something I want to use?
Yeah, so there are two aspects to it. One is, as a researcher, we provide a cohort discovery tool. So you actually don't need our involvement. We have a free self-service tool where you can put in ICD codes, CPD codes, medications, and then you'll be able to do it on your own to get some basic estimate of how many patients are there within UCI, maybe also across the UC, and also maybe at some other institutions as part of the cohort discovery network. So once you know that we have, say, 500 patients at UCI, you want to get more detailed information about them, then that's when you will submit a ticket through our system, which if you just type it.health.uci.edu, so you will see the request data section where you will find a ServiceNow ticketing system. Then you can describe your precise specification of the data, attach your IRB approved protocol. Then the honest broker team will be able to fulfill that data request.
That's great. That's great. And so under the umbrella of our topic being what's okay, let me ask this: when you receive that list from the honest broker system, I can imagine a researcher saying, this is great, but very broad, and many of the patients on the list probably wouldn't be actually appropriate. Can I go into the EMR and rule out some patients that I could easily find out by looking that they're probably not eligible for a particular study? Is that okay?
So I think I'll defer that to Mary. Or
could you repeat that question, please, Michael?
Yeah. So the honest broker system might deliver you a really nice list of possible patients with their medical record number and broad information available through CPT code, identification. But a researcher may have much more specific criteria, and so probably knows that's a great start, but that maybe a large portion of those patients wouldn't actually be eligible. And that could be learned by maybe just looking at their EMR for a few minutes. And so I think there's some question of whether or not that's okay to do at this step.
Mm-hmm. So I think I would default back to what the IRB approved. Did the IRB approve or allow the use of the medical record in that way once they obtain that data set? From there, then we go back to the access provisioning question and who is allowed to have access. And that depends on their role, their responsibilities, whether they have supervisory oversight and they've taken appropriate training. Maybe by default, they already have access. Again, I would go back to the IRB approval and determine, did they allow for that and start there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that answer. This is one of those complex areas, I think, that we all kind of struggle with a little bit. And so I appreciate that idea of really spelling out step by step what you intend to do in your IRB application, and as a place to really articulate and get the right kind of review of those procedures.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
If you had that HIPAA waiver, that partial HIPAA waiver, you could likely go ahead and do that because you're like doing a pre-screen of your patients. So that's why the IRB always asks those methodology questions about how you're going to identify patients. They want to know that so that, yeah, as Mary stated, is it appropriate and what are the appropriate approvals in order to do so?
Great. So John might have a list then from the honest broker system of patients that he'd like to contact about his study. What kinds of considerations might John have in sort of contacting patients identified through this method, and how can he best protect any of their health information in that communication process?
So I'll take first, and then Mary can chime in. So once we retrieve information about the patient, if your IRB allows you to access personal health information such as name, address, then you would have access to that information. Also, you need to have a recruitment plan already. Are you going to email them? Are you going to call them? So based on that, the action plan, then you can determine what's the best way of using the information that the honest broker retrieved. So in terms of a phone call, then obviously you will need people or some subcontract to actually make the calls. And if you want to use email or text message, then that's a different level of complexity as well, because you do need to use approved emailing services. you do need to use approved texting services that the UCI has a business associate agreement with in order to provide them the information. But we do have, from the honest broker point of view, we do provide a facilitation of once you have that information, what's the next step you need to go in order to email, text participants. That's all. Yeah, that's the information I can share now. There are a lot of complexity in terms of how do you actually do that. But I'll defer to Mary about some additional thoughts that she may have.
Sure. So Kai brings up some great points. Once you have that information and the IRB has approved, the appropriate waivers, they've approved your method of recruitment. Kai mentioned a couple of great examples. When you move from the clinical setting into a virtual environment and you are now contacting using technology, you really need to start considering that, there are additional HIPAA implications there. And for instance, with email, if you're planning to send an email to a patient regarding, for instance, their diagnosis of, or their condition of diabetes, and you say, hey, we received your email from the Honest Broker related to your status as a patient at UCI Medical Center. We know you have diabetes, and we want to survey you about the management of that, or your activity level, your diet. And so when we send an email that is that information, the combination of that email, the email going to the patient, with that email is their unique identifying information, and in the body or the subject line or links contained within that email, combined with the email address going to the patient, that together, the action of that email going out from UCI research to the patient constitutes, or one could make the argument that constitutes PHI. And so because of that, now we have to consider the platform in which we're sending the email. Have we consulted our health IT team? Have they done a security risk assessment on this platform to make sure that we can send this email in a way where it is not vulnerable to some other party? And so and the same goes for texting or any type of virtual contact. And so it does take it to a level of complexity when you are contacting virtually.
This is so useful. I'm going to have you, John is going to have you all on speed dial, I'm sure, by the end of this. So we're going to move on to vignette number 3, and Amir is going to lead us through this segment.
Thank you, Michael. So the third vignette is more around data security and data security issues, not just, of course, only related to EHR, but also when you want to integrate data from different sources. For example, it can be EHR, it can be like data that you collect using an mHealth solution outside the hospital and so on. And then you need to kind of look at these together. You need to communicate with these folks, and in general, when you have more like some sort of data, either EHR or outside the EHR system, and you're concerned about security issues, ethical issues, or privacy issues. So we have also put together a vignette for that. It's about Dr. Smith, who is a professor of computer science. By the way, when I was reading this, I noticed that we have a Dr. Smith in computer science here at UCI, but this is with I. Our Dr. Smith is with Y. So Dr. Smith is a professor of computer science, and he's designing an app to support the process by which psychiatrists work with their patients with depression to tamper off their medication as their depression improves. So the basic app has been developed by Dr. Smith, has been developed by Dr. Smith, needs to find out whether it meets the needs of psychiatrists and their patients, and whether it is easy enough to use that they will in fact make use of it. So basically, Dr. Smith wants to collect data on feasibility and usability from psychiatrists who work at UCI and from a few of their patients, of course, with depression. So he proposes to do some qualitative interviewing with these folks and asks to try out the app with a few of these patients, of course, and the interviews are with the psychiatrist. So the patients also would be asked to complete an interview before and after trying out the app. So there are certain concerns or maybe points that Dr. Smith needs to know more about. And first is about, in general, this emerging communication technologies, and of course all the opportunities that they have brought that can help us recruit research participants. So the first question would be, can you talk a little bit about some of these, some of these technology-related ethical issues that investigators should be considering when planning their recruitment strategy? And I just wanted to mention that, of course, all the panels are more than welcome to join. But I think we can start with Mary. Maybe this is more in her domain, but of course, everyone is so welcome to chime in.
Sure. So these are great topics. They're very complex topics. It's interesting that we use, the patients with depression for this example, because before I get into the ethical issues, I do want to point out that in this particular example, where that the fact that these are patients that have these special notes in their medical record, there's an added, HIPAA affords an added layer of protection for mental health records. And so there are additional requirements, and I would say that I do not specialize in that area, and I would defer to the compliance privacy officer of the health system to tease through those particular requirements, but I'm happy to address kind of generally outside of those additional requirements. So going back to your question about these new ethical issues presented by technology, and I think I would acknowledge that there is an increased use of health data for technology and to inform technology. And, technology really has gotten ahead of existing laws and regulations surrounding the use of health data and patient health information. And so I would say, I would like to start off by saying that these absolutely are ethical issues, and that, the regulations don't manage ethics. And so because, technology has advanced so rapidly, current laws and regulations in many areas here do not contemplate some of these challenges that we face in the area of research privacy and use of data for technology. So I'll start with saying that and see if you have any questions for me from there.
Well, that was a great answer, but I wonder if others, Christine, you want to chime in, or you want to say something about this?
I think this is really where I would defer to Mary.
All right, you're also trying to say something.
Yeah.
So, I'm happy to go into some of those challenges and some of those ethical issues that we're facing here, and I would say a lot of them revolve around privacy and whether a patient is what is the perception of the patient, and you know, will this harm, you know, trustworthiness of organizations, and you know, what is the patient experience if they're receiving, you know, emails, several emails related to their condition as a patient, especially if it is, you know, sensitive, extra sensitive data. And so, you know, some of these patients might feel that, you know, the use of their data and being contacted through, I guess, being contacted virtually, or they may, you know, feel that that's intrusive. Some patients may be hesitant to utilize technology in combination with their care or health-related information about them. And so I would say those are probably some of the main ethical issues as they relate to the use of technology in this way.
Thank you. I guess that would be also a nice segue to the next question, because oftentimes, and you kind of touched upon it a little bit, but oftentimes you need to also communicate with these participants, either the psychiatrist or the patients, right? So the next question is about this channels. Like, what kind of channels are considered as like secure when you communicating with potential research participants? And any suggestions for communicating with potential participants without unintentionally releasing their PHI?
Yes, so I would say that my first recommendation would be to check with health system IT to see what technologies are available currently that allow researchers to communicate with patients about their conditions. And so I would start there. I know, you know, clinicians are using MyChart. That's very closely related to Epic. But I believe there are other systems in place that allow this communication to occur. I just don't have a list. This is, you know, this would lie with the health IT department, and so I would defer to them. Now, regarding your question about unintentionally releasing PHI, I think this is probably difficult to do because you need health-related information about the individual in order to determine whether they meet your inclusion criteria and are a potential candidate that you would like to recruit. So just initiating the contact in general, again, could be argued that the act of doing so is protected health information. And I mean that more so when we're utilizing technology. So for instance, like the example we mentioned earlier, which was email. And so I guess the best way to mitigate those risks is check with IT security on, you know, the health system, because they will have a list of methods of communication that have already been evaluated according to HIPAA security standards. And, you know, those are the platforms that you would want to use to contact patients.
And I just want to throw out two there. One is RedCap, the other is Qualtrics. Those are approved HIPAA compliant environment for conducting surveys and other type of information gathering from patients. And if you use anything else beyond those two, then I think there will be need a special approval process. But yeah.
And what if, just a follow up on the same question, so what if it's more than just service? We really like communicating with this. Like, I know a bad example would be text messaging or these kind of things, but would some of these platforms also kind of provide services for like communication with this? Let's say a certain chat service and so on and so forth. If you really want to, you know, communicate with them in more like two-way communication.
Mm-hmm. I am certain something, you know, like that exists, but I don't know, I don't have the knowledge, you know, of IT security to know what currently exists and is approved for use at UCI Medical Center. But also there's the option that if this platform does not yet exist and has not yet been approved, you can go through a process to obtain approval, and they would perform that security risk assessment and establish a business associate agreement with that vendor, and a service agreement. And so there are ways to do it. I just the IT security group is the group that oversees that process.
Yep. And I just want to mention, if you want to use those kind of communication methods, we don't have any current tools, approved tools for doing so. But the research team, they are allowed to develop their own website chatting with the chatting function. And but that needs to be vetted by the IT, and there are a lot of security and privacy assurance procedures that need to be in place. But it's definitely possible.
Yeah, great. That certainly answers the question. And the third question or item is more about integration of data or linking data. Because some of this data is kind of being collected from might be coming from the EHR, but there are all these additional data that researchers like Dr. Smith may collect, for example, using portable sensors like blood pressure readings of these folks, or maybe using some mHealth scenarios and so on, or solutions. So the next question is that if a researcher has certain data that he or she has collected, like Dr. Smith here in this scenario, and also they need to marry that data or fuse that data with something that exists or reside in medical records. So what are the issues related to this, and are there kind of any solutions that you guys can propose?
Sure. So I would say the main risk there is security, and that data runs the risk of unauthorized disclosure or access to that data. But then I would say, and Kai can speak to this better than I can, but you run the risk of data integrity issues. There are you run into interoperability, data quality and reliability, and then who's obtaining that data and acting upon that data once it goes into the medical record. What are those expectations? Does the patient think that a physician is seeing that data and doing something with it and doing it right away? And so I think those are important pieces to work through before moving forward with transmitting that data. And so Kai, I hope I didn't overstep there. I know some of these are probably more so in your domain.
Yeah, this is a very challenging problem. So from the technical point of view, we do have tools for doing this type of data integrations. We have a FHIR that has an API which can do two bidirectional data exchange with mobile apps. However, it's much easier to get the information out than getting information in, because that has significant implications of the structure of the information, the legal liability of the information, the added burden to clinicians if they have to act upon that information. So it's much more beyond research issue. In fact, it has significant impact on patient care. Therefore, it will require some significant consideration if we want to implement such in actual patient care process.
Thank you. And I think you kind of answered this already, but just to share another scenario that this is quite this is quite common, is the fact that there are all these community organizations out there. Dr. Smith and myself, we did some of the research that not this doctors, but like the example. The things that sometimes there are all these community partners outside. They also, they also collect their own data. For example, they have home visitations. They may make some measurements like the blood pressure of their participants and so on and so forth. And they may have their own EHR system if it's really, it may not be really the standard EHR system, but a system and a portal or system that they log all this information. So how about if there is a third party involved? You have a little bit of data in EHR, you may have some data, and you may have their approval already to get that data. And are there certain like differences here, or the same considerations that you mentioned about a researcher himself collecting data is applied here?
So is the question regarding us as UCI obtaining the data from those third parties, or delivering the data to those third parties?
So maybe the question would be, which way would be more feasible and efficient? Like, as kind of mentioned about this, exporting data from their system and bring it to UCI to kind of have more secure kind of platform, or exporting from both places and having it in a third location that the researcher can start analyzing data and so on. We just want to know which one is less, kind of ethically and privacy and security wise risky and challenging, and what would be the best procedure?
So I would defer to Kai because I'm not as savvy with the flow of information one way or the other.
Yeah, so if you connect the data about UCI patients from community settings, and you want to merge the data with UCI medical records for research, not for patient care, then we have the environment for you to do so. Because when Honest Broker provides you medical records data, we will put that into a secure, protected environment. You cannot download the data. But we do allow you to upload based on administrator's review data that you may want to put into that environment, and then linked with the external data, the external data with the medical records. So then you can manipulate and analyze the data within the protected environment. So that is totally possible. But then all data will stay within that environment, which is the most secure, and then probably community settings, and then also allow you to really use both data in one place.
Great, that definitely answers the question. I think this was the last question for this vignette, but we wanted to also reserve some time for the Q&A. Margaret, I would like to hand it over to you to share some of the questions with our panelists.
Thank you, Amir. So I do have some questions that were posted to the Q&A. If there are additional questions that people have as we are discussing the ones that have already been posted, please go ahead and post those as well, and we'll see how many we can get through. If we don't have a chance to answer all the questions, we will respond later in an email format. So eventually we will get information to all of you. So the first question that came in takes us back to the beginning of our conversation, talking about recruiting participants in partnership with a clinician. And the question is, what do you recommend if clinicians are too busy to meet or refer patients despite offering incentives? In what circumstances is it appropriate to approach the patient directly? So maybe we can go back to Christine and ask, I know we talked about this a bit, but it sounds like somebody is seeking a little more detailed information about this.
So it's always my recommendation, as much as possible, to get the consent from that, from that physician, and to really do your best to try to make sure that they know that you'll be going into their clinic, in their waiting room, and trying to recruit patients, from their clinic. If a research coordinator is having difficulty, they've tried multiple times, pinging the investigator, pinging ancillary staff, my recommendation would be to use the power of your own PI to try and make sure that you get your PI to talk to faculty members in that particular clinic. It can be very difficult, and I completely understand this. But I think that it will be much more successful if you have the buy-in of the clinician, letting them know, and then they're giving you authorization to go ahead and just go into the clinic and be able to, recruit patients. As stated previously, depending on the complexity level of the study, they might be very comfortable with you just recruiting as many patients as you want because it's a simple questionnaire survey. And so they don't think that there's going to be any potential problem with that. But if your study starts to become more complex, where you're now starting to collect things like urine or blood or anything where there might be a bit of an intervention in there, you definitely want to make sure you're getting the buy-in of that physician, because those patients are being seen, and they need to make sure that from the perspective of, what's going on with the patient treatment of that individual, that will not interfere or have any issues with what's happening with their patients. So I just really want to encourage to do your best to definitely get your faculty lead involved, to try and talk to other, faculty who are there, and making sure that you can try and get them involved. It's going to result in the best success, in my opinion, rather than just going in there, doing it. If they find out you've been doing it and you didn't speak with them previously, they might become upset that you're approaching their patients and that you did not inform them, or at least try to seek their authorization.
Thank you, Christine. So we have two questions that relate to using telephone calls to recruiting participants. One participant in our webinar said, it sounds like the only technology safe communication is via phone call. Is this the preferred method? And another person asked, when contacting a patient you haven't previously met, but you have the go-ahead from the clinician, how much or how little should you share? What is appropriate information to leave as a voicemail? So in terms of reaching out by telephone to potential research participants, I don't know, Mary, do you have recommendations about this?
So I would say probably there probably does come with less technological challenges or compliance issues to address. Regarding leaving the voicemail, I'm rereading this question again. Let's see. In contact you haven't previously met. How much or little should you share? What is appropriate to leave as a voicemail? So now this is a question for you. You have to go back to the IRB approval and what did they allow? Because the IRB is reviewing the recruitment method and considering whether or not the patient will feel like the contact is intrusive, and whether or not their privacy has been violated. And so I would go back to the IRB approval to see what they have allowed with regard to contacting a patient for which you've never had contact with before. And then regarding the voicemail, that is, I would defer that question to the HIPAA privacy officer to ask what those requirements are. If it's protected health information, then there may be additional requirements around that.
Great, thank you. So a couple of questions about the honest broker system. We have a question here for the Honest Broker system, when we were asking about a certain disorder like opioid use disorder, we were told we needed permission from someone at the hospital to be able to get data on those with opioid use disorder. Who is it that we would need to contact to be able to make a request like this?
This is a question for, well, I guess I can do my best to answer. So there are additional regulations that govern the use of patient records related to substance use disorder. And so for that reason, there are additional requirements, and we must obtain additional approvals. One part of that requirement is the IRB approval. Another is that the researcher has to agree to handle that information in a certain way and must obtain, the approval for use of that data by a specific person that's defined under the Part 2 regulations. And so at UCI, I think I'm familiar with the case that's being presented, and this prompted sort of formalizing that review process. And so the use of that information would go through one of the established Honest Broker processes. And there is currently underway a data use agreement that does address the Part 2 requirements for using those types of records.
Great, thank you, Mary. I think this question would go to Kai. As someone who uses Epic for recruitment with an IRB HIPAA waiver, are there limits to the information of the EHR we are allowed to access? For example, I have encountered patients whose entire EHR is protected with a break the glass prompt. Are these patients recruitable?
Oh, it's not really a data question, because what are the data? Those are more IRB and compliance question. But from yeah.
I'm happy to answer that one, Kai. Those patients are, yes, was recruitable the word?
Yes.
Those patients are recruitable as long as we have the appropriate IRB approval for a HIPAA waiver, and they meet certain criteria. That when you break the glass, there's a prompt or a window that comes up and says, do you really mean to break this glass? There are these special protections on this record, and if so, why are you doing it? And then, the person accessing the user is required to check a certain box, make certain selections. And in the case of research, you have to check that research box, and you have to disclose the IRB approval, the HS number. So that on the compliance side and the auditing and monitoring side, that access can be verified when we see that this user has accessed this account that has break the glass, and they indicated it was for research under this protocol. Then you go in and, on the auditing and monitoring side, one could verify that that person was even connected with that project, or that project would even allow for access of that particular patient's record.
Mary, do you want to describe really quickly why there's a break the glass on those patients? That way people kind of know and understand that.
Sure, I can do my best. This is, again, it is a privacy officer. It falls under our privacy officer, but it maybe our privacy officer can join for the next panel. But break the glass is a feature that is affords these additional protections on certain patient accounts for those that are, for instance, employees or relatives of employees, or VIP, what are called VIP patients. So maybe someone, who is well known to the public. And so this feature basically affords these additional protections in order to help monitor for employee snooping and inappropriate access to those accounts.
Great, thank you, Mary. That's really helpful. So a question I think that would go to Christine, if a study receives approval from a cancer center DOT, does this grant permission to screen records from the clinicians involved in the DOT?
So a DOT, just to define for everyone inside the cancer center, is a disease-oriented team. These are multidisciplinary meetings that we have where we want to obtain approval from this multidisciplinary team of basic, translational, and clinical physicians and scientists that they want to move forward with that particular protocol. So if a DOT has approved that study, meaning they give it a thumbs up, they want to go ahead and pursue that study, it works well with the current research portfolio for that particular disease site, we should not begin screening until we receive that full IRB approval. I hope I'm answering this question correctly, or I understand the question correctly. So we want to make sure that we have obtained full regulatory approval prior to going ahead and just screening patients for a research protocol that's been approved and given the green light by the disease-oriented team or the DOT.
Great, thank you. So I'm not sure if I am going to explain this question correctly, but I'll read it as it's written. When emailing a participant to schedule appointments, send Qualtrics invitations, provide at-home sample instructions, and other logistical purposes, are we required to use the UCI Health proof point system, despite the message not containing PHI, other than the email it is being addressed to and the suggested questions that might be included? I'm actually not familiar with the UCI Health proof point system. Is anybody else familiar with that? No, I don't know how to answer that. No?
I'm not familiar with that.
Save
No.
this for later. Hopefully get back to you with some information on that one.
Well, if that means the emailing system, the email server, then we are working on embedding UCI approved emailing services within RedCap, so you don't need to worry about the email may not be secure. For Qualtrics, we don't have a way to influence that, so I don't actually know.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think the question is, so despite the message not containing PHI, other than that the email is addressed to and the suggestive questions. So that was what I was referring to previously in the discussion, where the act of sending the email and that email containing information about that patient's condition could be argued to constitute PHI, and therefore would have to adhere to HIPAA privacy and security standards.
Right. Thank you. We have a follow-up on the disease-oriented team question. Can we also leverage on the resources, clinical coordinators, for example, to screen and recruit patients? Or do we still need to provide our own resources to conduct screening and recruitment?
Yes, so our clinical research coordinators and those even outside of the cancer center can definitely, with the appropriate approvals in place, can definitely screen for patients, kind of be on the lookout, be aware, just have an understanding, especially if there's a particular study or trial that will be opening soon, and you want to be familiar with who these individuals are that could potentially go on the trial. So the clinical research coordinators, again, with the appropriate approvals inside the cancer center, specifically just for our department, we have an overall screening protocol. So with the IRB, and that overall screening protocol, as pushed through to the IRB and received approval, does allow us to screen patients in order to be able to determine if they are eligible for research trials or research studies. And so that particular protocol does allow us to be able to review those records and determine if we can find eligible patients to enroll into our research studies. And then clinical research coordinators, definitely, you know, when studies open up and when you're trying to make sure you're trying to enroll patients onto studies, definitely want to make sure that we're screening as much as possible. Again, from a cancer standpoint, we have these multidisciplinary meetings called tumor boards. And so we're able to screen at those particular tumor board meetings where new cases are discussed and determining what is the best course of treatment action. And so screening can also occur, you know, during those meetings when a case is being reviewed at that particular meeting. So clinical research coordinators are definitely, you know, have the ability to do this and are a good resource to do this.
Great, thank you. So we have a question, another question about emailing with patients. The questioner says, we are supposed to use UC Secure to email patients. However, lots of my patients claim to not be able to open the messages. What should we do?
Well, I think I would bring that to IT security, but I would also suggest the use of MyChart. In place.
So messaging to the patients through MyChart?
Mhm. If it's possible, if they have a MyChart account, if they're truly a UCI patient. I think that's the more secured method of communication.
Okay. So now we have a question about consenting. Do signed consent research forms need to be uploaded to the patient's EMR if they are participating in a research study at UCI, specifically if the study is not an intervention, but rather observational?
So this would depend on the use of UCI health items and services. Is this information related to the care of the patient? For instance, even something as simple as a blood draw may require uploading that consent to the record, but it's very difficult to answer that question without having more specifics.
Okay. We have a question about whether non-clinicians can propose a clinical research study in their community. I'm not quite sure what is meant by in their community, but Christine, do you think you can address that one?
Yeah, can you repeat that again, Dr. Schneider?
Yes, can non-clinicians propose a clinical research study in their community? Maybe we could ask Giovanna if you could send in a follow-up to explain a little more about what you're asking, and we'll move on to a different question.
I can chime in on that one. You know, the IRB is charged with assessing whether or not the investigator is adequately trained and educated, or has the appropriate expertise in order to oversee the conduct of the trial or research study. And so my thought is that is a question that would be answered by the IRB. They would make
Yeah, good point.
I would agree with that. Most likely the IRB would, if a non-clinician wants to be a PI on a study, they would more than likely require that a co-investigator or somebody, if it's clinical in nature or treatment related, be named onto the study as well for very obvious reasons.
Right. We have a follow-up question, Christine, to the point about using clinical research coordinators at the Cancer Center. Someone wants to know how they would initiate that process. How would one begin working with the clinical research coordinators at the Cancer Center for screening purposes?
So I would say definitely you can feel free to talk to me first, and then I will direct you in the right way. We have a number of cancer clinical research coordinators, all kind of delineated by disease site. So depending on where you need to recruit or what specific area you're looking for. If it's breast or GU or GI, it's going to be a different set of team members that'll report up to a clinical research manager. And so if you want to partner with the Cancer Center, I'm happy to do that with you. You can send me an email. You can look me up. My last name is Hui, H-U-I, and I can direct you to the right individual so you can partner with any of our cancer clinical research coordinators.
Thank you, Christine. And that's a good segue for me to let everyone know that we will be putting together a fact sheet of contact information and resources related to this conversation, and we'll be sending that out to you in a future email. So that will include Christine's contact information as well as the rest of our panelists. I think we have time for a few more questions here. Let's see. Can main campus researchers communicate with patients through MyChart? So Mary, that you were just suggesting that MyChart would be a useful way of communicating, but I know from personal experience as a main campus server person that there are firewalls. So the question is that possible if you're a main campus researcher?
It's a good question and a really good follow-up question to my answer earlier on, because I think I was as narrowly focused in my earlier answer to assuming that we were referring to somebody who was already involved in the patient's care and already had a relationship with that patient, and these were related to maybe ongoing communications. Now, if this is a main campus researcher who has access to Epic, I don't fully know the answer on whether or not they can use MyChart in that way. There is a group at the Med Center who dives into topics such as these. And MyChart messaging is one of the big topics because there is interest in expanding the use of MyChart to communicate with potential research patients or research participants. Sorry, there is a current group evaluating whether or not we can expand beyond those already involved with the patient's care. So I guess that question would depend on whether one, technology allows you to do so, and then two, are you already involved in the patient's care? And based on being a main campus researcher, I'm guessing the answer is likely no, because otherwise that it would likely be a UCI Health workforce member. And so I know that doesn't fully answer the question, but there is a group tackling this issue currently.
Thanks, Mary. We'll try to get information about that group on our resource list in case people want to reach out directly to them. So we're coming down to the end of our allotted time, and I want to give Amir time to close us out. There are some questions remaining. As I indicated, we will try to answer these in text form, either directly to the questioners or just in a general communication to everyone. I want to really thank our panelists for devoting their time and energy and expertise to this event. I've learned a lot. I hope that our attendees found it useful. It does sound to me like perhaps in a future event, we might want to reach out to the IT department and have them involved and available. But I'll turn it over to Amir for some wrap-up comments.
Thank you so much, Margaret. Before we close, I just want to have to share two items with everyone. The first one is that an evaluation email will be coming to them. Maybe they have already received that. We really appreciate your comments and your inputs, especially because this is a series, and this was the first part of this series. The next one is gonna focus on recruiting research participants from local community. So any input from you would be really valuable for us, especially to improve our the next parts of the series. I think the next one is going to be maybe in about 2 to 3 months. So we're going to definitely send out the announcements way before that. So you're more than welcome to join us. And I would like to also echo everything Margaret mentioned about basically we had a great, I personally learned a lot from our panelists. And thank you so much again for your enlightening comments and also making time to share your experience with us and also answer the questions from our attendees. Once again, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Margaret and also Michael, and all the attendees and participants. And we'll hope to see you again soon in 2 to 3 months in the next part. Thank you.